Hi, everybody. This is Chrissy O'Malley, and welcome to Better Science Teaching. Today, what I'm going to do is go through the ISEF forms one at a time so that you're a little bit aware of the issues and the reasons why you might need to consider filling out each form and take a look at the rules and guidelines about science fair and pre-college research and see if that's something that you need to pursue for your project. So in a different video, in an earlier video, I went over the checklist for adult sponsor, Form 1A, the research plan, and 1B. So I'm not going to cover those in as much detail with this video, but we will talk a little bit about some of the issues and concerns and the reasons why you might need some of the other forms. If you go to the link below, you'll find a link to a PDF document that you can open up that has all these forms in it. It comes from Society for Science and the Public, and they are the folks who run the International Science and Engineering Fair for high school students. They also run Broadcom Masters. Again, that's a program that's for middle schoolers. Generally, they aren't required to do all of the forms for ISEF, but it's a really good idea for middle school kids to kind of know what these guidelines are and to have a little bit of experience with them. You may even find that your local or state fairs actually require students to fill out these forms, even if they're not required for ISEF. Sometimes they do get used that way. So this first one here is a checklist for an adult sponsor. It's got some really basic information here, but the reasoning for this, the rationale, is that this is for a student to walk through with their adult sponsor, which is a person who's helping them make sure that they're following the rules and guidelines and completing the things that they need to do. And this walks through and asks you some questions about your project. And some of these are tip-offs for things that need to be forms. And so if you're checking a lot of these things about, if you're working in a regulated institution or research setting, if you're using humans, vertebrate animals, potentially hazardous biological agents or chemicals, or you have other risks that are involved, if you're checking those types of boxes on this form, you may have other forms you need to fill out. The student checklist is the next page. This, again, is just basic information for your project, about your students. It does have a tip-off on here about if your project is a continuation or if it's related to a project you did in the past. You probably want to do a continuation research progression form, Form 7. I would err on the side of filling out that form. If it's close, go ahead and fill out the form. It's better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have done it. Again, there's the research plan. There's more information about that in the other video. And the last one I covered in the other video was this approval form. Most folks aren't going to need to do anything with this except for fill out your name and sign it. All right, so forms we haven't talked about before. This first one, the regulated research and industrial setting form. I'm going to move my picture here in the window just a little bit so you can see the title. There we go. All right, so if we take a look at this one, this is a form that has to be completed after experimentation, and it specifically needs to be filled out by the adult who's supervising the student. And the reason for this form is so that everybody is very clear on the roles of the student with this project. It's really important for science fair that students are only presenting work that they actually did, and not work that others did, or not work that they did in collaboration where others were doing a substantial amount of the effort, something that might not be accessible to kids. And so a lot of the time this will come up if students are working at universities or hospitals or research settings. And it's really important that if students are working in those locations, that they have their adult sponsor fill out this form to really clarify what their role was and which parts of the project belong to the student, because only those parts that the student did are things that really can be considered for the purposes of science fair. It has to be their own. And this is just an opportunity for everybody to clarify what the working relationship between the student and the adults were, and make sure that the student is presenting their own work. Another thing you should know about this is this form specifically, underneath where it says to be completed by a supervising adult, it says, please make sure that you don't print this double-sided. So it needs to be 2 single-sided sheets of paper. There's signatures too at the end. So we just have questions there. When students are connecting virtually with people, so either by email or they're doing Skype or Google Meet or whatever, and they're communicating with somebody who's not nearby. So I've had several students do that in the past. I have one this year that may need this form. And that's just another form to clarify things. What is their scientist doing? This is really only specifically required for people who are doing those 4 sort of troubling, more complicated projects where you're using human participants, vertebrate animals, potentially hazardous biological agents, or hazardous substances and devices. And so that requires a qualified scientist so that everyone is aware of exactly what the risks are and what students are doing. What we don't want to have kids doing is dealing with something that's actually hazardous and not getting proper guidance on how to make sure that they stay safe and reduce risk. And so the qualified scientist form is really important for that. One thing to note down at the bottom is that it's possible that if the qualified scientist is someone who is offsite or isn't able to allow that student to work in their research space, what may actually happen is that a designated supervisor is somebody that the student needs. And so frequently we'll have a project that requires a qualified scientist where a student is working with something that could be considered hazardous. And instead of doing their project at home, it's much safer for them to do it at school. And so one of the teachers in our building will be their designated supervisor and be the person who's making sure that that student is following safety guidelines and following the requirements of that project. Next, we have a risk assessment form. This is another one that sometimes I have students do, even if they say things like there's no risk. But if they're dealing with something where somebody could look at the title or the abstract and think, hey, this seems really risky. This is a kind of form where you can go through and identify what all those risks are, just so that everyone is aware of them. You may actually look at this and say, there are no risks involved here. This is a very safe thing. This is something that people do all the time. One where this really comes up is when students are doing sports projects. So if you're running around kicking a soccer ball, are you going to get hurt? Probably not. Could you get hurt? Well, you could get hit with a soccer ball in the head, or you have to be careful about inclement weather. You can come up with things that are risks with that activity, and then you can put them on the form, and then you can clearly state why you're not concerned about it or what you're doing to mitigate those risks. That's the purpose of this form. You're not outing yourself. You're not going to be looked at more closely because of it necessarily, but you are sort of covering your bases. You're kind of making sure that everybody knows that you've thought about risks and that you're doing the best that you can to not have those things happen. Again, signature by an adult. Next is a human participants form. This is one that needs to be completed anytime that a student is working with humans. So this form is just one per project, and it's going to be submitted when you send it to your institutional review board. And so the top is the part that the student has to fill out, and then the IRB fills out the part at the bottom. And so we have an IRB at our school. Any school can have an IRB. It's not particularly special in that it needs training, because the people who will be part of your IRB presumably already have the training that they need to be able to assess the things that students need to do. And so the first one, the most important one, says medical or mental health professional. We frequently will use our school nurse. I believe she's a registered nurse. So we'll have our school nurse actually go over anything that students are doing that involves humans, just to make sure that's okay. We have a teacher who specializes in biology and anatomy and physiology, sorts of things. And he also does not mentor students for science fair projects regularly. What I mean by that is that his classes don't require science fair projects. And so we'll send them to our school nurse first, and then the stack will go to my colleague who teaches biology. And then after that, the school principal will get them. And they are very generous about giving us their time to fill these out. And it's really helpful for the students to understand that all the adults around them are making sure that these kids are following proper guidelines. With this educator, if you've got another, it doesn't really require that it's even a science teacher. Just throwing that out there. If you've got a friend in your building who is willing to do this for you, then you can use them too. So this form 4, this human consent or this human participation form, that's one per project. This next one is going to be one per participant. So after you've gotten approval to do your project, you have to have informed consent. So the basis for informed consent is that you're telling the people who are participating in your research what it is they're going to do, what risks are involved, what data you're going to collect, what you're going to do with that information. And each person has to give that informed consent. They have the opportunity to ask questions and make sure that they know exactly what they're going to experience. If your participants are minors, if they're children, if they're under the age of 18, you also have to have parental permission. So what this means in practice is that if you are doing a project that has underage people in it, you need to make sure that you give them this form in advance of that. And so sometimes students want to do something with a survey, or they do a taste test or something. We don't usually allow them to do taste tests on their own. We have had things like chewing gum and seeing how they do on a quiz, things like that. But you have to give out the forms on a different day than you do the actual testing, because the parents have to sign the informed consent form before that person can participate. If you don't have the informed consent, you can't use that information in your study. So that would be bad. What most students do is complete this form all the way down to the adult sponsor, qualified scientist, designated supervisor, name, phone, and email thing. Complete the top part, and then run as many photocopies as they need. They don't have to independently fill this out for every student. Of course, if you're using the PDF from online, you can type it in there and save it, and then just print off whatever ones you need. The other opportunity that you have with this form is the important part is the information and not the form itself. So what that means is that you can embed this information into something like an online survey and have somebody electronically give permission for it, which is something that some students and I have been pursuing this year because of issues with remote learning and how are we going to collect our data if we can't do it in person, so some things like that. So we're trying to figure out how to embed those into surveys, or to reformat the survey so that the data collection is anonymous, and then this form isn't required. Next, the vertebrate animal form. This is a form that's required if you're using vertebrate animals. And so that includes, this is a little bit of a squidgy category. Like some parts of it are pretty obvious, right? If you're using like a whole organism, like a dog or a cat or a chicken, this is pretty popular building. That there, you have to be able to think about some other things. And so I may make a video about vertebrate animal rules, but generally vertebrate animals include, according to the rule book for science fair, live non-human vertebrate mammalian embryos or fetuses. Tadpoles are considered vertebrates. Of course, frogs are too. Bird and reptile eggs starting 3 days or 72 hours before hatching. So if you predict they're going to hatch in the next 3 days, they count as vertebrates. Before that, they don't count as vertebrates. Other non-human vertebrates, including fish, at hatching or birth. And then there's an exception. If you're using zebrafish embryos, you can use those up to 7 days after fertilization. After 7 days, they have to be considered a vertebrate. So those are the things that are considered vertebrates. And I've been told by the SRC folks that there are actually heated arguments about what's a vertebrate. But if you know you have a vertebrate or you think you have a vertebrate, you need to fill out this form. And this is so that vertebrates are, we need to worry about them. These are ethical concerns involved there. We don't want our students torturing animals. And so these forms help make sure that everyone adheres to the federal regulations about research that involves vertebrates. And so you have to make sure that you name them. They're also very concerned that you have qualified people who are advising you on your project. And they're concerned about, see, here's a second vertebrate form. The second page is 5B. You have to describe in detail what the student is doing with this project, what happens to the animals afterwards. If you have a lot of animals dying, that could be a problem and should be investigated. Lastly, if you're a regulated research institution, if you had to fill out Form 1C because you're working at a university or a hospital or a research center, this stands for, I think it's International Animal. I wrote this down. Please hold. If you had to fill out that Form 1C, you're going to also need to make sure that your regulated research institution, institutional animal care and use committee also gave their approval. So I'm sure that that's something that if you're working at an institution and you're going through their IRB process, somebody should alert you to that, but it's something to be aware of. Next are using potentially hazardous biological agents. This is for microorganisms, rDNA, fresh and frozen tissue, including a bunch of things, blood products, and body fluids. This is not one that a lot of students bring up to me. I think it's just because I work with sophomores and they don't have experience at this level quite yet. I think if I had more seniors, I would end up with more of these. My one recommendation with this is if you can get away from vertebrates and you can use tissues or something else, that's better. You always want to try to downgrade your risk and your and which rules you're falling under. So that's why they kind of have these in order. Are you using humans? Because that's something that you should be very careful about, and you should be ethically aware if you do that. Next, beneath that, vertebrate animals. Okay, if you want to use vertebrate animals, is there a way that you could use something else? Could you use microorganisms? Could you use tissues? Could you use blood or blood products and look at chemistry? So these are all just downgrading from sort of highest ethical concern, and we're kind of coming down. The concern here with this is that you could introduce something that could cause disease or cause damage to someone or be unethically sourced. So I've had some students who want to work with blood, and we actually will go for a synthetic blood product instead of actual blood, because if you're using a synthetic blood product, it drops you away from this because synthetic blood is not considered potentially hazardous. But you want to go through and discuss this. One thing that comes up with these PHBAs is what level your lab is. So when I have students who want to work with microorganisms, including fungi. So when you have students who want to do the thing where they treat something and see how much mold grows on the bread, like that would fall under this, because it's fungus, but it's a microorganism. I know people don't tend to think about it that way because it's not a bacteria, but you want to be careful with fungi. They can cause infections in people and you can get sick. This form comes up a lot too for people who want to test microbes that are growing on different surfaces, or if you can modify or treat a surface so that it doesn't grow bacteria. This form would come up. You need to be aware of what kind of lab you're using. So question for us is, what final biosafety level do you recommend for this project? This is something that the qualified scientist or designated supervisor will fill out, and they know what that means. But the Cliffs Notes version is that if you're in a BSL-1 lab, you're working with something that's unlikely to cause disease, but you have very minimal safety protocols in that lab space. It's things like we wipe down our surfaces when we're done, and it's not really that intense, to be honest. So you wear the appropriate gear, you wear the right PPE, and you clean stuff. That's what you do in BSL-1. In a BSL-2, you can study things that have a little bit more risk because your lab is a little bit better suited for it. You have containment, you have spaces that are dedicated to that sort of thing. You have the ability to, you have sinks and you have eye wash stations and you have something that can decontaminate your waste, like you have an autoclave. That generally, so that's about where our lab is. I believe the rules say you shouldn't be working with anything above a level 2 on a project that you intend to present at the International Science and Engineering Fair. When you get beyond level 2, BSL level 3 is for things that can cause lethal infections in humans. And so your risk kind of gets very high at that point. Generally, students would have difficulty getting access to those lab spaces anyway. And if they were trying to do a study on those sorts of things, they should not be doing them at home. Basically, anything that needs a lab, I offer student space so that they can do them at school with me, just so I can keep an eye on that stuff. Because I don't want kids storing microbes in their fridge with the food that they eat, or out on their counters, or a place where their cat might lick their petri dishes and stuff like that. I'll let kids do plants at home, but I prefer they do microbes in the lab and fungi. A level 4 lab is something that has the highest requirements for safety. And by the time you're doing that, you're studying things that are life-threatening, that frequently don't have good medical procedures for curing those diseases. We're looking at things like Ebola, things that are really, really infectious and hazardous, and students certainly shouldn't be working directly with those organisms. One thing to note is that there are rules if students are working in a BSL-2 lab that indicate students should not be opening petri dishes of unknown organisms. So if they know what the organisms are and it's a model organism, something like E. coli K12 or something, then they can open their dishes. But if they're doing the thing where they go around and they swab for contamination, those petri dishes should not be opened unless you get special approval from ISEF directly, which I have successfully done. So if you have any questions, you can reach out to those folks. I can help you or point you in the direction of someone who can help as well. We're just going to move forward here. Human and vertebrate animal tissue. This is something that if you are filling this out, you've also already filled out 1A. This is completed by the student researcher. What stuff is being used? Where did you get it? I know this isn't a big space, but fill it up. Put some information in there so that we know exactly what's going on. Some of the biggest issues that we've had as a scientific review committee at our local science day is trying to figure out what a student meant and if they understood what the rules were. So put information there so that we know what you're talking about. It makes things a lot easier for the fair, and it also shows that you're more knowledgeable about what you're doing. Lastly, Form 7 is a continuation form. This is a form that's required if you are doing a project that's an extension of a prior project. I would argue you even need to do this if it's at all close. A personal example, I did a project that was about energy conversion on a bicycle, and then the next year I did a project that was aerodynamics. There was nothing the same about those two projects except they both involved bicycles. But I still filled this form out because you want to make sure that when you enter a science fair or you're talking to your judges, if they look at it, if they recognize you from a previous year, you want to make sure that you can identify how your new project is different than your old one. And some of them get a little bit tight. Probably just saying I did the same experiment again so that I added more data is probably not going to get you there. Like, you need to change something that's fundamental about your project. You need one of these forms for each year that's similar. So you compare it to last year's, compare it to 2 years ago, compare your current project to 3 years ago. Each one of those is going to need a separate form. And that kind of brings us to the end of our forms. Keep in mind when you're sending your forms in that one more. I know I've said it in other videos, but when you're collecting information on this informed consent form from people, this is one that you don't need to submit. You should submit your sample, but you don't need to submit each person's form when you send it in when you've applied to a science fair, because the people in the SRC should not be seeing your participants' names at all. You should always strip the names off. So you keep your forms, put them in a folder, have them at your project, but you don't need to be submitting them anywhere. So I think that pretty much covers anything. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the comments below. I pay attention to that. If you guys have other questions about these that I need to discuss or some of the rules in the guidebook, please make sure that you reach out to me and let me know. I'd be happy to do those for you. I hope that you stay safe and you be well. We're heading into Thanksgiving. I hope that you guys all have a great week, and I'll see you soon. Bye.